all I would have said was, I was born in Green Bay and I once sold hot dogs on my little fields. I'd like to thank the IWC for this incredible event they put together. It's amazing. And I think last night we witnessed the profound impact that cultural norms can have on the relationship that we have with non-human beings. And this morning I'd like to talk a little bit about how to infuse a local indigenous perspective into this contemporary wolf stewardship. One important way of doing that requires sort of melding these tribal views with states. And that's really what I want to talk about today. I'm not going to use my time to review the deep relationship that the Ojibwe had with Ma'inkin and the wolf. If that's your interest, I certainly hope you got to see Tanya Aldred's presentation yesterday. But I will reiterate that it's a primary teaching of the creation story that the wolf is a more than human being whose fate is intricately tied with that of the Ojibwes. And so as a result, I don't think there's anything in what Western science calls wildlife management that's sort of more significant to Ojibwe people and to Ojibwe governments than this relationship with the wolf. I also want to point out, now I'm already skipping behind my slides here. I also want to point out, though, that the Ojibwe's interest in Ma'inkin certainly doesn't end at the reservation boundary. Okay, so just like you saw yesterday, these issues with national parks, there's special concerns about small parcels of lands and wolf packs that straddle the reservation boundary, and certainly those are there. But for the Ojibwe, the interest in Ma'inkin goes well beyond into the ceded territories and really well beyond that. Here in the Midwest, I think most people are familiar with this term Ojibwe treaty rights. But this is an international conference, and for folks from out of the area, I want to explain a little bit about what that means. In the mid-1800s, when the Ojibwe ceded lands that they were occupying here in the Midwest to the United States government, the tribal representatives were astute enough to retain certain use rights that the tribes held at the time. And I think most people understand that those use rights include things like hunting, fishing, and gathering. But a lot of people don't understand that they actually go beyond that as well. Now, the existence of these rights was reaffirmed by federal courts here in Minnesota, in Wisconsin, and all the way to the United States Supreme Court. But these cases went into pretty significant detail on how to meld state and tribal interests for some species, but not for wolves. There's a couple of reasons why that's the case. First of all, these initial treaty cases really focused on species that both the state and the tribes harvested. And so these extensive stipulations were established to make sure that those species were protected from over-harvest. But very little attention was given to species that weren't harvested, or which maybe one party was interested in harvested and the other one was opposed to. The second reason is that, of course, at the time that these litigations were taking place, back in the 90s, there were relatively few wolves in many parts of the ceded territories, those that were being litigated. And they were under the protections of the Endangered Species Act and federal regulation. These lawsuits were between the tribes and the states, and so there really wasn't much to discuss when it came to wolves. And the only real mention of Ma'inkin in the tribal conservation codes is that they would be listed as both protected and endangered species. Now, of course, after the tribes recovered their rights, Ma'inkin began also to recover the lands that they historically occupied, and there was this great expansion that took place. Now, more than a third of the regional wolf population lives just in the 1837 and 1842 ceded territories. That recovery, of course, has led to efforts to delist wolves. And it's really these delisting periods when the authority for management theoretically shifts to the state and theoretically the tribes, that this lack of a wolf stipulation really becomes critical. And I'd say that's especially true because I would argue that the tribe's rights regarding Ma'inkin have been trampled to a certain extent by the states, particularly in Wisconsin. Now, superficially, this conflict tends to play out between the tribes, represented by Glyphwick in some treaty areas, and Department of Natural Resources from the respective states. But in many ways, the bigger conflicts that the tribes have exist at higher political levels. In Wisconsin, for example, there's strong conflicts with certain state legislators and also with the Natural Resources Board that sets most of the policy for the state DNR. The Wisconsin legislature injected itself in a big way into wolf management in 2012 when they passed the law that you probably heard about, requiring an annual wolf season anytime wolves aren't listed as a state or federal species. That undercut not only the DNR's authority, but it really limited their ability to apply the best science to wolf stewardship. The 7-member Natural Resources Board in Wisconsin currently has a voting block of 4 individuals, all appointed under a previous Republican governor, who, in my humble opinion, are generally anti-wolf, anti-tribes. They're also anti-DNR, they're anti the non-hunting public, and I think they're generally not respectful of the application of science to resource stewardship. And I think a clear example of that occurred last fall when the DNR was preparing for a fall wolf season. That their staff recommended a quota to the board of 130 animals, which the board indicated that they were going to inflate up to 300 animals, and in what was really an undisguised attempt to get around the tribe's efforts to protect Mahingan. That fall season was eventually blocked by the courts, and so it's really unclear who has the ultimate authority to set that quota. There's also currently a member of that voting bloc who, in coordination with the state legislature, has refused to step down from his 6-year position, even though his term expired almost a year and a half ago now. His action is keeping an extremely well-qualified person, Sandy Nass, who's been selected by the current governor, who was selected by the voters of the state, obviously, to replace. Sandy's not being given the same option that he had to serve the state. Now, the hurdles that the tribes faced with the board also link back to this lack of stipulation. While the treaty case indicates that the state is required to attempt to reach consensus with the tribes on important regulatory matters, that effort, when it happens, usually occurs with the DNR, not with the board, and it really undercuts the importance of that. Wisconsin, you heard, is updating its management plan. The tribes and the DNR could theoretically sit down and reach agreement on a lot of important points, only to have the Natural Resources Board throw them out the window without ever having direct consultation with the tribes. Now, there's a number of ways that you could balance state and tribal interests, I think. There's always that wonderful litigation option that's so effective and cost efficient, but maybe there's better ways to do that. The relationship that the state has with its own constituents is very different than the government-to-government relationship it has with the tribes. But I also argue that the relationship it has with its constituents tends to greatly influence the relationship it has with the tribes. Now, as an example of that, I think some people suggest there's this big divide between the state and the tribe and their wolf management objectives. In fact, Ojibwe wisdom for the wolf-human relationship really aligns closely with the conditions that we have seen for most of the last 50 years here in Minnesota. Anytime that wolves were listed under the Endangered Species Act as a threatened species. Okay, the wolf population grew essentially to its own natural level on the landscape, its own natural distribution on the landscape. There was no recreational harvest during those periods, but there was lethal control when necessary, non-lethal control in recent years, some strong preventative programs in place. Of course, the Minnesota population has risen to about 2,700 animals, the highest here in the Midwest. And so how did the Minnesota public feel about that? You know, the attitude survey that was conducted found overwhelming support for the number and the range of wolves in the state. And the point of that, I think, and relatively little support for hunting or trapping. And the point of that is that it's really going to be easier for the states to work with the tribes when they better represent the entirety of their constituents better. Now, over the past couple of decades, Glickwood has intersected with all 3 states in wolf works, and I guess we've seen the good and the bad and the ugly at various times and in various states. And a few things I think we have learned maybe from a practical perspective. I think first and foremost here, it really involves these committees that the states tend to develop to get input on their plans. And the most important point here is that, jump back a little bit, but is you have separate science and advisory committees. This is a critically important point. Science has its limitations, but can be incredibly useful in evaluating stakeholders' concerns, and it can help find solutions to those concerns. And on scientific matters, the professionals ought to have a louder voice than the non-professionals. While it's really helpful to have scientific liaisons on the stakeholder committees, a single advisory committee that's made up of a mishmash of both professionals and stakeholders doesn't advance either the best scientific recommendations or the best stakeholder recommendations. There is a time, to meld those things together later on. That's the sausage making, but we need to see the ingredients and their quality before that mishmash takes place. Now, the makeup of the science committees tends to be pretty straightforward, but advisory or stakeholder committees can be a little bit different. One thing I'm going to suggest, and I think this ties in a little bit to the last talk that we had, is include groups that actually want to work towards resolution. Not every group does. Some groups profit from conflict, and they're really not interested in seeing those things fixed. These groups might still hold concerns that are important to listen to and for a state to address, but including them in the committee essentially makes the group non-functional by design. It's important to include moderate organizations. They tend to be more flexible. They tend to be more willing to listen to new data and new perspectives and help you find that middle ground. Similar to this, I think it's really critical to include individuals who represent only themselves. These folks actually represent the average public probably better than anyone who isn't actually a member of any of the committee or any of the organizations on the committee. And I do want to give kudos to Minnesota DNR for doing this in the recent round with the committee they created for input on their advisory plan. Now, it's kind of an old point at this point, but it's really important to focus on issues and not numbers. Probably one of the least informative questions you can ask an organization is, how many wolves do you want? That question tends to lock organizations to a number that may not actually be very closely related with their actual concerns. It also tends to push organizations into extreme positions because they sometimes are concerned that the state's just going to take sort of the average recommendations to go with that, and I've actually seen that happen. So make the organization state their concerns and their objectives. It doesn't seem like there's always room between somebody pushing for 500 wolves and somebody pushing for 1,500, but you might actually find a middle ground, at least their actual concerns. Before I leave the topic of stakeholders, I want to address one other point. People wonder, is it really appropriate to have tribes on these committees when they're not stakeholders? I personally think it is, okay, and I think there's a couple of benefits from that. One, the tribes get to listen to the stakeholders directly, and they get to hear their concerns, and they get to know what kind of pressure the DNR is under. Secondly, they get to make their case directly to those stakeholder groups without asking the DNR to sort of be an intermediate in delivering that message. That being said, this participation always has to come in addition to government consultation and not replace it. And I really think it's kind of important. It's a small thing, but I think getting a special title or a designation for the tribal representatives in those groups can help. I want to wrap up quickly here by discussing the actual state tribal consultation. There's a huge body of work out there on this stuff, and I'm not an expert by any means on the science of it. Unfortunately, most of the people involved in the consultations aren't either. So again, I think a few things from practical experience maybe are worth mentioning. Some of the things like focusing on issues rather than numbers apply here, but a few other points I'd want to make. One should be really obvious, but it's often overlooked. Consultation takes place when both parties agree it's taking place. Sending somebody to inform the tribes of what you intend to do, or even somebody who just comes and listens without having it valid back and forth, isn't really consulting. You have to involve the right folks. It's important that both the state and the tribes come to the table with people who are trustworthy, people who have the authority to make decisions. They need to understand the law and certainly abide by it, but not be limited to things, have the courage to do what's right, regardless of whether the law demands it or not. Talk early and often and honestly. Consultation by definition is impossible when you've already decided what you're going to do. And be above board. I know the tribes that I work for certainly appreciate hearing an honest statement that they disagree with, and sort of a glib statement that might be intended to appease their interests. Finally, I think really be committed to the process of consensus. This is usually required in treaty law, but it should go without saying. And it's important to come with an attitude of respect and commitment to this process. And I would suggest with a focus on ecosystem health, rather than political power. That can be a common building block to work from. And a great place to start that would be to commit to developing state tribal stipulations on a free will basis rather than being forced into it by litigation. In closing, I will say these are not giant steps. We heard giant steps last night. These are small steps, but I think they're the least we can do to respect the treaties and to respect the obligation that we all have to steward mining and, for their sake and for our own. And with that, I'll say I'd like to thank Lipwick, who helped provide support for me to be here today, even though I retired from there 6 months ago. And certainly the center again, and for all of you and for your time. So I'd be happy to take questions.